Welcome to Channel's Business Global with me, Juliana Olayinka, reporting from just outside the Palace of Westminster in central London, where global power, policy and markets intersect. Coming up on today's show, the war between the United States and Iran is over. The Strait of Hormuz is reopening. Oil prices are falling. But what does the peace deal actually mean for African economies that have been absorbing the shock for nearly 4 months? I speak with Dr. Carol Narkle, CEO of Crystal Energy, and from Geneva, I've been with the Africa Collective, a gathering of some of the continent's most forward-thinking business and investment leaders at one of the world's most important financial centres. What is the message from Geneva for Africa's economic future? Then later, World Sickle Cell Day falls this week, and the burden on Nigeria and Africa could not be greater. A Nigerian diplomat, a British philanthropist, a sickle cell warrior. 3 voices, 1 urgent message. But first, here at Westminster, the news that has dominated global markets and global politics this week began not with a battle, but with a post on social media. On Sunday, United States President Donald Trump announced on Truth Social that the deal with the Islamic Republic of Iran was complete. His words were characteristically direct. "Ships of the world," he wrote, "start your engines, let the oil flow." The agreement brings to an end nearly 4 months of conflict between the US, Israel and Iran, a war that began on the 28th of February and unleashed one of the most severe energy shocks the world has seen in decades. The effective closure of the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which approximately 20% of the world's oil and gas supply passes, sent Brent crude soaring from the low 60s to above $100 a barrel at its peak. Global fuel prices surged, inflation accelerated, supply chains blocked. The peace deal was brokered by Pakistan, whose Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif announced the agreement minutes before Trump's post. Iran's Supreme National Security Council claimed a historic victory, asserting that the United States had accepted Tehran's 10-point plan. Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu has sought a meeting with Trump in Washington to discuss the terms. The market reaction was swift. Brent crude fell 4.7% to $83 per barrel on Monday, its lowest level since early March, while oil prices remain 40% above where they stood at the start of the year. But as one analyst noted this week, you cannot put an egg back together after a fall. Full recovery to pre-war price levels will take time, as ship owners, insurers and vessel crews must first be convinced it is safe to transit the strait. For the United Kingdom, which imports significant volumes of energy and has seen petrol prices at the pump reach their highest level since the war began, the deal brings relief but not resolution. Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer welcomed the agreement while cautioning that the diplomatic effort to sustain a lasting peace must now begin in earnest. For Africa, the continent that has absorbed the energy shock through fuel shortages, rising food costs and strained public finances, the question is not whether the peace deal helps, it is how quickly that help arrives. I've been speaking with Dr. Carol Narkle, CEO of Crystal Energy and one of the world's leading energy economists.
We have a notable reaction to the news coming from the Middle East, and that tells me one thing, because we haven't really seen much changing on the ground apart from the cessation of the military actions. It tells me that a lot of these upward pressure on prices that we have seen, the many dollars added to prices, are primarily geopolitical risk premium, and the fear of the unknown, the fear of further escalation. And as a result, the fact that there would be at the moment no such escalation in the foreseeable future has already eliminated a big chunk of that geopolitical risk premium, but it has not eliminated it completely. So that's why I think it would be too premature to expect prices to go back to the pre-conflict time, as long as we don't have a final deal in place that can guarantee a lasting stability and lasting peace. And at the moment, still, we are yet to see the traffic being resumed from the Strait of Hormuz, and all other things, happening at the same time to see prices going back to the pre-conflict level, which were really in the low to mid 60s. Let me explain a bit. When you use the terms open and close, they are a bit an exaggeration of the situation, because We rarely saw a day or a couple of days whereby we had complete zero traffic. I mean, it's a region, at the end, we have to accept that a lot happens behind closed doors, and there are lots of things that take place without us realizing that they were taking place. So I don't believe that we had for a sustained long period a complete closure of the Strait of Hormuz. And therefore, the opening does not also mean that we're going to see the full number of tankers that you were seeing on a normal day before the conflict, like in the hundreds, happening suddenly. And there are so many reasons for it, but primarily, I would say, technically speaking, given the fact that the strait has a very quiet, narrow point at some level, then we cannot expect all the ships suddenly to sail at the same time. So there are some bottlenecks to overcome, assuming that there is no further risk of escalation. But even if we have 100% peace in the region, and then the two parties get on well and everybody lives happily ever after, it will take us maybe, and again, but not months, really, just maybe days and weeks to clear the existing bottleneck that we have in the Strait of Hormuz because of the closure of the strait over the last few months. If Nigeria is exporting crude but is relying on the import of refined products because they don't have sufficient capacity to produce those refined products domestically, then I think maybe the effect is neutralized. And more importantly, what is happening to those windfalls? Who is getting them? Is it the government or is it the private companies, international players, and therefore some of those profits find a way out? How is the government investing those additional windfalls into the economy? So it's not a clear, simple formula, but I would say as long as you are relying on imports of not just oil products, but other important feedstock for your agriculture sector, for your industrial sector and manufacturing, then maybe the net effect is not as positive as people might think because Nigeria is exporting more. And also another thing we have to remember is that, yes, higher prices mean higher revenue, but to benefit more, you need to be able to produce more. And I think this is where this is something that Nigeria should think about in the longer term, because Nigeria has tremendous potential of offshore, deep water, and ultra deep water oil reserves, and but they need to boost investment in those areas, and that could be an indirect benefit in the longer term, where investors would feel incentivized to invest into more difficult fields in countries such as Nigeria.
And while the world's attention was fixed on the peace deal this week, a very different kind of conversation was taking place just across the Swiss border, one that may matter just as much for Africa's future. Africa Collective Geneva, the largest annual gathering in Switzerland dedicated to Africa's economic agenda, held this week under the patronage of Switzerland's State Secretariat for Economic Affairs. The two-day programme brought together senior decision-makers, industry leaders, investors and innovators from across the continent and the world for invite-only roundtables, deal rooms and the flagship Swiss African Business Day. The theme this year placed Africa's strategic position at the centre against the backdrop of shifting global dynamics, the peace deal in Iran and what a reopening of Hormuz means for the continent's trade and energy future. I was there, and this is what the conversations in Geneva told me about where Africa stands and where it must go.
So what we are now seeing is we are seeing African companies and organizations coming and seeking out partnership globally. And I think this on a bigger scale than what we've seen before. At the same time, there is, of course, a lot of dialogue on, intra-African trade, and we're seeing a lot of international players also wanting to be part of that conversation. We're seeing a lot of the conversations that are taking place breaking out of sectoral silos. So some of the conversations that we've already had today in the lead up to the Swiss African Business Day tomorrow, which takes place during the Africa Collective Geneva Agenda. We've seen healthcare players talk to financiers. We've seen rooms with VCs, established corporates, international ones, and African-based corporates as well. Really come into a room together and push the boundaries of the conversations that they're having.
There is a large gap, but it's very focused on where you are sitting locally and regionally, and it demands. The question is very broad, and it demands an analysis that is more country-focused, nuanced, exactly. And because each market, if you see the problem that's being solved in Kenya versus Nigeria versus South Africa versus Morocco, they have different, the cultures are a little bit different, the way to solve the problem is a little bit different. And what is clear is that there is consumer demand and there is a gap in each market. The early investors or private equity investors in Africa have very much taken an American or European approach to how they've invested on the continent. We thank them for bringing that model and going through some of the early pains to it. And I think us, as the next generation, let's say, of investors, we've applied an African twist to that. And some of the lessons we've learned, for example, is how do you take scale into consideration? How do you empower local partners, expose them to what you can learn from other markets, but then empower them to do it also in their home markets in the way that makes the most sense to them. So there's a lot more trusting, there's a lot more partnership in play compared to, I think, what was early days. Does it mean we're going to get better returns? We certainly hope so, but I think we are better equipped to reach that than I think previous investors have done.
Some of our companies, they have been invested for such a long time in Africa that they're considered part of the economy there and part of their national economy. So, of course, the brands Nestle, Novartis, Roche, and so forth, they're very well known. If you look into the trade statistics, investment statistics, what you'll find is that in several cases, Switzerland is among the top export countries for them. So we import a lot from Africa, but we are usually also among the top 5, top 10 investors, foreign direct investors in many African countries. So our footprint is significant. And I think maybe we don't have a big profile because, we like to employ local people because they know the country. We want to create jobs locally. And sometimes maybe you'll find the country manager, the CEO, who's a Swiss, but not even that. It might be a local or somebody from the region too. So the Swiss flag flies high, but it's not always seen.
Many more very, very important conversations are indeed taking place on the continent these days. You only have to see the conference calendar and the caliber of the people who are coming all the way to Africa to discuss African issues. It wasn't always the case, by the way, right? So I think it's entirely true, that criticism. And also I think we'll do well as a continent not to necessarily critique something because we think it's wrong, because at the end of the day, Africa has to go where capital is. Africa has to go where its benefactors are. Africa has to sell its story. So rather than saying, come to me, to convince people, to persuade people, you have to go to them.
I think what I'm always interested to hear is institutions and corporates telling me that they have found new partners, new potential collaborations, new potential investment. So really something tangible coming out of the open exchange that's happening in these sessions. I think how we want to drive this is that Africa Collective has specific circles on different topics and trends, say the venture circle, technology industry that I'm very interested in personally as well, and that being really an in-depth discussion in that area with key stakeholders that are working and investing in that space. And that then enables very concrete discussions on what's possible, and ideally also leaders finding themselves around commonalities and potentially doing things together going forward. And for me, that would be, I think, the biggest success, apart from great talks, is actually concrete collaborations coming out of it.
Still to come on Channel's Business Global, World Sickle Cell Day. Nigeria carries the heaviest burden of this disease anywhere on the planet. 3 extraordinary voices join me to tell us why awareness, change and saving lives cannot wait any longer. Plus, the biggest business stories of the week. All of this after the break. Do stay with us. Welcome back to Channel's Business Global with me, Juliana Olayinka, reporting from just outside the Palace of Westminster in central London, where global power, policy and markets intersect. Shortly, we'll be talking World Sickle Cell Day. But first, the biggest business news stories of the week. Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer announced this week that children under the age of 16 will be banned from social media in the United Kingdom, including TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, X, YouTube, Snapchat and Reddit. The measure is expected to come into force by early next year. For Nigerian and African families raising children in Britain, navigating identity, culture and community between two worlds, it is a significant and directly relevant development. The G7 summit concluded in Evian, France on Wednesday, bringing together the leaders of the world's 7 largest economies alongside invited guests, including Kenya's President Ruto, India, Brazil and South Korea. Behind the scenes, the summit was shaped in part as a direct follow-up to the African Forward Nairobi summit, with President Macron bringing to Evian a first loss guarantee mechanism built around the African Trade and Investment Development Insurance Agency. Whether those commitments translate into tangible financing for African development remains the defining question. And the 2026 FIFA World Cup is now into its second week, and the economics are extraordinary. The tournament is projected to generate $5 billion for the US economy alone across 16 host cities. But the business story with the sharpest edge is the one surrounding exclusion. Trump's travel bans have effectively barred fans from 4 qualifying nations, Côte d'Ivoire, Senegal, Haiti and Iran, from entering the United States. FIFA sells the World Cup on the promise of global participation. When governments restrict who can attend, the commercial and reputational costs fall on the sport itself. Africa has 10 teams competing and a continent of fans watching from a distance. Today is World Sickle Cell Day. The theme this year is Voices of Resilience, Awareness, Change, Saving Lives. Nigeria carries the heaviest burden of sickle cell disease of any country on earth. Approximately 150,000 babies are born with the condition every year. Across Africa, the disease affects millions, yet research funding, treatment, access and public awareness remain critically inadequate. 2 major sickle cell treatments were withdrawn from global markets in 2024, leaving patients with fewer options than ever before. Thank you so much for joining me on Channel's Business Global on what is a pretty historic day for World Sickle Cell Day. Your Excellency, let me start with you. You're a diplomat, a humanitarian, and now the keynote speaker at this event. Nigeria has the highest burden of sickle cell disease in the world. Approximately 150,000 babies are born with the condition every year. As chairperson of the Nigerian Governors Spouses Forum, what are you doing to put sickle cell on the national policy agenda?
Well, thank you very much for that question. We know that Sickle Cell Day is on the 19th of June every year. And then we also celebrate Sickle Cell Awareness Month in September. So we've been doing a lot in government. I want to assure you that the government is facing up to this responsibility. We First Ladies have been working really hard on this matter. We've made sure that we have, testing, genotype testing across the states. We've made sure that we do counseling, because you see, we have to take it further than just the medical interventions. For us as First Ladies, we're the soft power. So what we do is make sure that we have government, civil society, the religious leaders, the traditional leaders, and all of these people, plus ourselves, making sure that we're fighting this cause. As you said, we have a high burden of sickle cell. So government is trying to make sure that there's newborn testing, there's infant testing, there's counseling when people are getting married. As you know, they're supposed to test. Unfortunately, we still have low awareness, and we're trying very hard to bridge this gap. And this is why I'm here. This is why I'm talking to you today, to create awareness even more so that it complements what government is doing in making sure that we get to the root of this and we stem the tide. Nigeria not just only has the highest burden of sickle cell, we also have the highest burden of healthy carriers. So, so it becomes difficult when people are getting married to tell them, don't proceed because, now feelings are involved and things. But when we continue to counsel, make sure we test, because we know that when you test babies, you have a higher chance of making sure that they live a healthy life. When they get tested later in life, then it becomes a problem. So I assure you, government is really on top of this and making sure that we get all these people tested.
Thank you. Let me bring in Lady Anne Welsh. Lady Anne, I'll just hand over the mic to you here. You were born with sickle cell disease. You left investment banking, pretty lucrative, to find Painless Universal, and this is because of your lived experience of pain. Most people would have stayed in their career. What made you walk away, and talk to us about what you've built and how it's helping with advocacy?
As you said, yes, I was born with sickle cell, and I still live with sickle cell disease because I'm unable to do the stem cell transplant because of my blood condition. I have severe sickle cell anemia where I can't do blood transplant and transfusion. So I was in investment banking, and that has always been my dream. My father was an accountant, and he always wanted us to do well in school. And investment banking was something my husband said, I think this is more your personality. It was so, it paid very, very well. I was really shocked when I started my job and how much I was getting paid. I thought to myself, wow,
you hit the jackpot.
a young analyst like myself getting paid this much and just leaving university. But at the same time, in all that glamour that I was presenting, people didn't see behind the scene of what hard work that was being put into it. Behind the scene, I remember at work one time, a number of times, the ambulance came to pick me up from work because I got sick, and the long hours. It was so glamorous on the outside, but inside I was burning out, and my sickle cell could not take that anymore. And I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to tell my bosses, because they would say Friday you leave work, and you leave work in a perfect condition. Monday you're calling saying you're in A&E, and you repeatedly this conversation. And then my bosses were saying to themselves, this can't be right. Why are you doing this? Are you hiding something? And we know we have the culture in the UK where people go clubbing Friday, Saturday.
And they
thought
I'm in the right industry.
And they thought that was what I was doing. But in reality, it was just my body was burnt out, and I didn't know it until Friday hit. When I get home and I tried to relax, and I realized, oh gosh, sickle cell really kicks in, and I'll be in hospital for a week and I miss out. So that was when the real aha moment kicked in. I needed to build purpose. I needed to do something that was different from what my pain was going. Do something that people could actually see my pain and understand that it doesn't matter how glamorous your life is. When you're suffering, you need to let the world know and work together to see how we could all conquer and solve that problem. So yes, that's where the Painless Universal came from.
Babatunde, let me bring you in. I know Her Excellency invited you to this discussion. You founded the Richard Coker Foundation in 2004 in memory of your cousin Richard, who died at 32 from complications of sickle cell and leukemia. 22 years on, what has changed and what has not changed enough?
I think, as you said, we founded the Richard Coker Foundation 22 years ago, and with my auntie, Miss Julie Coker, we found that at the time there was a lot of mysticism with sickle cell, a lack of knowledge, especially here in Europe. Globally, there was stigma. And I think, especially coming from the American side, that the cobwebs of that has been blown apart. So people understand they need to have, as Her Excellency said, a genotype test. They need to be aware that people, as Lady Anne said, have sickle cells, so they need help. And dialogue and mental health is better, and also the medical practitioners are more aware of sickle cell.
Well, sadly, that's all we have time for today, but as always, do get in touch with your comments and suggestions. I'll see you at the same time next week for more in-depth business analysis on Channels Business Global. Goodbye.